Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome Joseph Bouchard back to the show. Joseph, this is far from your first time on the show, but I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me again. So I'm originally Canadian, but I work in Latin America as a journalist, and I mostly report on security and geopolitics. I pay a lot of attention to the US, China, and Russia as they relate to the region, and I cover the region for the last 3 years or so.
So I heard some rumblings. Actually, I saw some news headlines that there was something afoot in Bolivia, an attempted military coup. And I hate to admit it, like a lot of Americans, I got distracted by a certain debate that took place, but this sounds like it was a pretty serious challenge to authority in Bolivia. Bring us up to speed on what was taking place and what was the outcome of that attempted coup.
So it was very surprising to see the news. The country had been relatively stable for the last 6 months or so since the last period of blockades and protests, but it really rocked everything. So this general who had a few hundred military and police forces with him marched in La Paz, and basically, which is the capital, and then broke into the presidential palace doors, only to have a civil discussion with the president for about 2 hours. What his demands were that the president resign and that the main opponent of him within the socialist movement in Bolivia, which is the same party as the president's, wouldn't be barred from running for office ever again. And he also demanded that two very prominent right-wing figures who are currently in prison for terrorism be released. And the president basically told him no and arrested him. And right before he was arrested, he went on this, the general, the rogue general, went on this long speech about how the president put him up to it and it wasn't organic or natural. It was actually a self-coup. And then this really spurred a bunch of conspiracy theories about what really happened. A bunch of people think it was the CIA, that the left was in on it together, even though they're kind of in a civil ideological war at the moment. That the president was the president, and it seems like now most of the country thinks that, even though all that was said was the general basically said that with no evidence.
So was it a bloodless coup then? I mean, they forced their way in, but is this one of those instances where nobody died?
Yeah, there were no injuries and no reported injuries and no deaths. It was really just a march, and then they made their demands, and then many people were arrested that conducted the coup and participated in it. And then most people within the socialist movement seemed to rally around the president. And polling goes to show that his support has increased since then. But then factions in the center, the right, and some in the left are also very skeptical. But even then, it's remained very civil. There's been no security issues so far.
Wow. So where do they go from here? I mean, that's a pretty serious challenge, even though, there wasn't bloodshed. But is it safe to say that the situation is stabilized, or are they potentially looking at more instances like this in the days ahead?
Well, for now, things are stable. Nothing's really happened since Wednesday, which was when the coup happened. But we never know. Bolivia has sort of a cyclical issue with protests and violence, where every 6 to 12 months there's blockades and protests and sometimes violence. There's been a few coups in the last 100 years. So I wouldn't be surprised if things derail from here. There's judicial elections later this year, and then there's a presidential election scheduled for next year, although we don't exactly know when it should be. And that kind of throws a wrench in that, where, an attempt at a coup really doesn't inspire a lot of hope in people for democracy and stability. So we'll have to wait and see. But for now, things are stable.
Does something like this usually end up being followed by, I don't know, a purge, for instance, of police and military forces? I can't imagine that the president is resting easy, wondering, is there anybody else in their ranks that might likewise, want to rise up and challenge me?
That's a good question. Well, since Wednesday, the president's made about a dozen arrests, including the general. It's definitely not comparable to some other critics talk about the self-coup, while they usually self-coups result in hundreds or thousands of arrests. Like we saw this a few years ago in Turkey, for example, where the president orchestrated this really weird uh, false flag operation to consolidate his own support and then arrested thousands of people before an election. But this really, the scale isn't really there, but that remains to be seen. But so far, it's been a few higher up people in the police and the military and the general, and that's about it.
So I have to ask you this, Joseph. What interest, if any, does the U.S. have in what's going on in Bolivia? And I guess that's kind of a roundabout way of asking, is the CIA or, or other intelligence agencies at play in things like this?
Well, usually when they do participate, things end up being more successful in the way they conduct the coup. This was kind of a ridiculous attempt. There was almost no coordination whatsoever. Their demands were very far-fetched. There was no way the president would agree to it. And the only really way they did it was, yeah, force their way in and then have a discussion. That's not really going to put a lot of leverage on the president to do anything. And then there was no public support. CIA used to do a lot of interventions in Latin America, especially in the 60s to 80s period, where they supported different military dictatorships in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, even Bolivia. But those coups tended to work, tended to be successful and have a coherent vision, whereas this really doesn't. It seems like it's just some rogue general who is on the right and sees the president as illegitimate and wants his own ideological allies to be released from jail. And in terms of how this plays out for the US, well, this definitely hurts commercial interests. Uh, Political instability doesn't really help markets or investment. The US is quite interested in participating in the lithium sector, but there's been quite a few protests in the recent years in the lithium sector that's really blockaded progress. And I see this as another instance of instability leading investors to not be interested. So I think this is going to hurt the Bolivian economy. And then as a result, the US is not going to be as interested in investing in Bolivia as they might be in other neighboring Andean countries that
How
have similar mineral wealth.
how does this affect Bolivia's neighbors? Do they worry that that instability could spill over into their own countries?
Yeah, well, there's been a kind of a mixed reaction with different left-wing and right-wing governments. So, for example, Javier Milei, who's the very infamous president of Argentina, the self-styled libertarian or anarcho-capitalist with weird hair, he's called this a self-coup and himself called for new elections and said that there needs to be change in leadership and really propagated that narrative. And then on the left, Lula from Brazil, and then Maduro in Venezuela, as well as a few other left-wing leaders in the region, they've sort of sided with the president and said that the coup attempt was ridiculous and was horrible and it's bad for democracy, and issued their support to either the president or the president and his opponent on the left. So there's been kind of an ideological divide, but for so far the US hasn't spoken out on it.
So is Bolivia's president fairly secure in terms of popular support from the people? Would they be more likely to stand with him?
It's hard to tell because there hasn't been that much polling done by independent pollsters yet. But the polls that have been done suggest that his support is up since the coup, although there remains a very big ideological conflict within the Socialist Party in Bolivia. And elections are about a year away, so it's hard to tell what's going to change. But polls have them head to head if both leaders were to run. And the president isn't really seen as a charismatic, strong leader. So this, in a way, could help him, but we have to see what the people think at the ballot box come the judicial elections in a few months.
Boy, I bet that feels like a long time to have to wait. When you have, I assume this probably still feels like there's some questions hanging over people's heads. Those who want to get a better feel for what's going on in Bolivia, obviously you have been writing about this. Are there some good resources you could point us toward to get a better feel for what's happening there?
Sure. Well, there's a few reputable newspapers in Bolivia. If you read Spanish, La Razón and El Deber are very good. If not, there's some international newspaper presence, mostly from the agencies like the AP and the AFP. I'd recommend the Reuters, and I'd recommend reading their work. Unfortunately, there's very little media coverage of Bolivia, mostly because it's a small country, 12 million people, and it's very divided, very unstable politically. But I would say if you can read from the news agencies as well as try to translate some of the articles domestically.
Again, we're talking with Joseph Bouchard. He is a Young Voices contributor and a journalist. And where can people find you on social media?
You can follow me on Twitter at GeoPaulWonk or on LinkedIn where I post all my articles. And thanks so much for reading me.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Victoria Churchill back to the program. Victoria, good to see you again. Take a moment and share just a little bit about yourself with those who are meeting you for the very first time.
Well, so great to be back on with you again, Brian. Since I actually started my time with Young Voices, I've actually recently, in the past few weeks, joined the New York Post as one of their swing state reporters. So I am going to be doing that for the next 6 months. Well, I guess it's almost 4 months now, leading up to the election. So I'm covering Virginia, which is my home state, as well as doing some work in Western Pennsylvania, as well as Eastern North Carolina. So very excited to be in that role for the next few months, along with being a Young Voices commentator.
Well, first of all, congratulations. That's quite a feather in your cap. Let's talk about the debate last week. I know a lot of people have weighed in on this. I'd be very curious to get your reaction. My understanding is this is the earliest that a presidential debate has been held. Does that ring true?
That seems to be true from at least the sources that I'm reading. So, yes, this is definitely very interesting to have this debate. Obviously, before either of these candidates has secured the formal nomination of their party, the RNC is coming up here in just a couple weeks in July, and then the Democrats will be having the DNC, their national convention, to, at least at this point, formally nominate Joe Biden. There's obviously some rumors that he may not end up being the nominee. But at least as things are looking now, he will be the nominee come the middle, or at least middle to end of August. I think the 19th through the 22nd of August is their nominating convention. So yeah, we have these two conventions, and again, obviously both of these gentlemen are their party's presumptive nominees, but we are going ahead and having this debate before the convention, which is definitely atypical for the presidential campaign season.
Okay, so I have to ask, if neither one of them has secured the nomination yet, what's the purpose of having a debate like this?
Well, I think it was just to kind of showcase really where we're at as a country, because again, both of these gentlemen are the presumptive nominees. Obviously, most of the nominating contests have happened in various states. So, in terms of like delegate allocations and things like that, these guys are the ones. They just need to go through the formal kind of nod from their party leadership. Obviously delegates from across the country will be attending both the DNC and the RNC. So, I think to me, this is just a way to answer a lot of the questions that were on voters' minds. I think some of them were answered, some of them I think still remain unanswered. But I think this is definitely an interesting time and way to kick off the presidential primary, or excuse me, the presidential generals season. We've been in the primary season for basically 12 months now, 18 months ahead of election day. This time last year we were obviously having the Republican primary debates. Then they were dubbed kind of the Republican vice presidential debates because Donald Trump did not kind of see the need to participate in any of them. And I think that is kind of something else that is interesting to know, that this is kind of the first time that we've seen Trump on a debate stage since 2020, since I think it was just the one debate that he had with Joe Biden then. So this is really kind of bookending that. And then obviously Biden didn't debate anybody on the Democrat or the liberal side, whether that was Dean Phillips, the congressman from, I believe, Minnesota. He was kind of seeking to be an alternative to Joe Biden. I think obviously RFK Jr. running as the independent candidate has also kind of sought some debate time and hasn't been granted that by either of the major parties, or, obviously the Democrat Party, which uh, I think is interesting to note. A majority of his family members have, obviously stepped out and supported Joe Biden, but he kind of remains the odd one out in that camp.
So I have to ask, what was your reaction to what you saw last Thursday night?
Well, I think it's interesting to note that I think kind of the collective reaction was that actually CNN did a pretty good job. Even Trump himself said that he thought he was treated fairly. I covered the debate. I was at a watch party covering it for the New York Post in the Virginia Beach area, where then Trump was for his first post-debate rally in Chesapeake. So it's obviously the southeastern part of Virginia. But at that rally in Chesapeake, Trump actually himself came out and said that he was treated fairly, which, is interesting because these were debate rules that, at least from what I had seen reports of, were mainly pushed forward by the Biden camp. But then on the other hand, Trump's team agreed to them and he didn't have any complaints about the rules. So, that is important to note. But, I think on the other hand, there are still some prominent issues, some unanswered questions that I think still remain on the minds of voters. One issue that I know has been quite a big one, at least amongst Republicans, and kind of how it's been treated by the Democrats over the past couple of years, has been that of Title IX. That wasn't brought up at all by the moderators. There's kind of the twofold issue of it that Trump is going to, at least from based on what he's saying, he's going to do away with anything as quote unquote, what the Biden administration likes to point out, which is transgender protections. They've obviously taken Title IX, which was just a few sentences, and they've made it into, a multi-thousand, if not multi-million word document, kind of redefining gender and sexuality and protections based on those classes within the United States. So, that is an issue that Republicans are really kind of trying to hang on to, particularly with the issue of women's sports, but that's something that really goes beyond that issue, right? It's just the fact that, just realizing what I perceive, and I think probably you probably perceive, as just a biological fact that men and women are different. That doesn't mean that one group is lower or lesser than the other, but there are just inherent biological differences, versus the Biden team and parts of his administration are kind of going back on that traditionally recognized fact and narrative. So, that's really one thing that I think has, at least from the way that I see it from the conservative Republican point of view, that's got a lot of, common sense, middle of the road Democrats even siding with Republicans in some instances is, this idea of, even going back to the Supreme Court confirmations, right? Like Ketanji Brown Jackson being, I'm not a biologist, so I can't tell you what a woman is.
Right.
Just kind of flashes in the pan like that people that don't necessarily pay attention to politics day to day, they hear things like that because they come out of kind of the political bubble and really make it into the mainstream media and press and coverage in that regard. And I think, at least again, the way that I see it, being on the right side of the aisle, I think some people are waking up to some of the insanity that we do see on the left.
Victoria, we have about 2 minutes left. I got to get your reaction to President Biden's cognitive, abilities. I don't think I've seen him stumble a time or two, but that was kind of painful to watch, at least, from my vantage point.
I would definitely agree with you there, Brian. I think it was definitely a little bit painful to watch. And I think not only on stage, but really the way that it was handled after the fact, his wife, Jill Biden, going up to him. I mean, she's a teacher, but so maybe that's kind of where these mannerisms come in. But I felt like she was probably talking to a kindergartner and saying, good job, Joe. You answered all the questions. You made it through. Like, that was just very condescending. And I don't think that, you talk to, I have a husband. I definitely don't think I talk to him like that. And I don't see myself talking like that to him, multiple decades of marriage on down the line. So, not only the way that it actually played out on stage, but I think after the fact is definitely concerning to see, even some folks that are very close to the president talking down to him that way, and probably, nodding to the fact that his cognitive abilities maybe even wouldn't have made it for him to make it through the debate.
Well, and the media reaction, I mean, the legacy media, look, I think there was some feigned, We never noticed this before, but even they could not deny that. Okay, he was struggling out there.
Absolutely. I mean, the New York Times, for one, I think they ran about half a dozen op-eds the morning after the debate of people saying, I love Joe Biden. He's my friend, but he needs to get out. Or, I love Joe Biden. I know him, but this isn't the guy that I've known for the past 50 years. So I think kind of this disappointment may have been a little bit expected on the Democrat side because I mean if they didn't expect it, they did a really good job turning around those op-eds for the next morning, that's for sure.
Okay, one quick question. We only have about 30 seconds, but will there be another debate?
I think so. I hope so. If not, definitely a vice presidential debate. One of the things that we were tracking debate night at the Post was kind of the Google trends that we were seeing. And that was definitely one that we saw play out during the second half of the debate. People saying, Kamala Harris debate, vice presidential debate. Obviously, we don't know who who the Republican nominee for vice president or Trump's pick will be. But I think people are looking to see who that next person up will be for the Democrats as well as the Republicans.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome James Erwin back to the program. He is a Young Voices contributor. And James, before we dive into our topic, and it's a doozy of a topic, let's first of all get you acquainted with those who are meeting you for the first time. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks so much. Great to be here today. I am a Young Voices contributor based in Washington, D.C. From Maine originally, which might come up later, but have some experience working on Capitol Hill. I currently work at Americans for Tax Reform. I work on tech, telecom, and free speech issues, and have been published in National Review, Town Hall, The Hill, The American Thinker is what we're going to talk about today. Real Clear Politics. You can find my work at many of those places. And hopefully many more in the years to come. But I would also recommend checking out The Ordinary Times. It's a great little magazine published out of West Virginia that I've been writing for. Got some good art and culture reviews there that I think are worth checking out too.
Well, let's dive right into this topic about flags. Except it's not really about flags, but anyway, I know that Justice Samuel Alito from the Supreme Court was under a lot of fire for, a couple of flags. One was apparently an upside-down American flag, which is a symbol of distress. The other was an appeal to heaven flag, which has its roots in the Revolutionary War era. Bring us up to speed. First of all, why was this a controversy in the first place? I didn't think that either one of those things was necessarily shocking in and of itself.
No, it has been made so in the last few months by the media. And this is, I do need to emphasize how much this is a media-driven narrative. So Justice Alito is not well liked by the New York Times, to say the least, and many of these other left-leaning publications. He is very much a constitutional conservative. He's an originalist. That is a very mainstream legal philosophy. It's not the only one represented on the court, but he's certainly one of its progenitors. And occasionally he gets to write opinions, and one of the ones he was given to write was the Dobbs opinion. So a lot of this has to do with abortion and whether that should be a federal or a state issue, which was the heart of the Dobbs decision that he wrote. Apparently he was in a dispute with his neighbor, or his wife was. She raised an upside-down American flag as a symbol of distress. Not fully sure what that story is. Not anybody who tells you they know the full story there is lying. There's, this is a neighborhood dispute. Can't give you too much background on that, unfortunately. But what we do know is that they also years ago flew the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is a flag with a pine tree on it. It says Appeal to Heaven at their vacation home on the Jersey Shore. And so did Leonard Leo, who is a conservative activist that raises money to promote Supreme Court candidates. And a lot of that, by the way, it was in the wake of the borking all the way back in the 80s, when there was no response. There were left-wing donors buying ad space and running ads on TV, attacking these justices, and there wasn't anybody defending them. Leonard Leo was the guy who recognized the need for that. And so there's a real political campaign. It's unfortunate that we have to have those because it shouldn't be this political, but because it started, it's only natural that there'll be a response. So Leonard Leo has been leading a lot of that, and he's good friends with Justice Alito. I think, were in the Federalist Society together. But anyway, the Appeal to Heaven flag is a historic emblem of the American Revolution. If you watch the excellent John Adams miniseries from 2007 from HBO, as I do every 4th of July and will be on Thursday, you will see it in the opening credits. It's one of the many flags of the Revolution, along with the Gadsden Don't Tread on Me flag and the Betsy Ross flag, Benjamin Franklin's cartoon of the serpent, join or die. All of these things are the iconography of the American founding. And so people who are fans of the American founding and feel a special attachment to the Constitution, as you might imagine a Supreme Court justice would, like to fly flags like this. And they're especially popular in my native New England. I'm from Maine, as I mentioned. And there are actually a lot of pine trees around that region of the country. And so there are a lot of pine tree flags as well. And basically, the New York Times alleged that because people who were flying these flags at the January 6th rally, I'm not even sure if there's any evidence, there might be, but I'm not sure there's any evidence of anyone bringing one into the Capitol during the actual riot, because a small percentage of the riot, of the rally goers broke into the Capitol, which was obviously terrible and ought to be condemned loudly by anybody who believes in the Constitution or law and order. But there was a large rally outside with people waving flags like the Appeal to Heaven flag and like the Gadsden flag and like the American flag, Old Glory herself. Either way, whether or not they were inside or outside the building, to claim that these people now own these symbols and anybody who might fly such a flag is therefore a supporter of what happened on January 6th is quite specious. And yet that's what the New York Times has claimed. And that's what the Washington Post picked up. One of the interesting tidbits that I've heard just in DC gossip is that the Washington Post actually had the photo of the Appeal to Heaven flag at his property years ago and didn't run a story because they didn't think it was worthwhile. They thought it would be too spurious to connect the two. And it wasn't until just a couple months ago the New York Times got a hold of it and decided they would run the story. And so then suddenly the Washington Post kind of had to jump in too, because that was the story of the day. But either way, there's been now this full court press to associate these iconic flags of the American founding with these rioters on January 6th.
I remember, and I used to share this in various articles about, people wanting to ban flags of this type or another. I remember a photo from about 100 years ago, it was in the 1920s, of the Ku Klux Klan marching. And I believe they were marching in Washington, D.C. under Old Glory. There's the stars and stripes. And my point isn't that, they must be legit. It was just that, they did not appropriate that symbol. They marched under it as if, this is our country, but that doesn't mean that they owned it. And it seems like it's kind of a political gotcha now. And that's the Appeal to Heaven flag, same way. Talk to me about Maine's flag. You mentioned there's some changes that may be happening with the Maine state flag.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the Klan, because this raises the question, who owns these symbols? And that's what the real debate is about. And some have wondered, well, does that make the American flag a symbol of white supremacy, for example? Well, according to the more left-wing activists at the New York Times, the answer is yes. And I think that conservatives really need to understand a couple of things. One, we shouldn't be naive about the intention here. The intention here is not simply to go after the Supreme Court. It is to delegitimize all of the symbols of the American founding and therefore the founding fathers themselves. This is all of a piece with the 1619 Project, claiming the American Revolution was about slavery, which of course writes, half the founding fathers who were abolitionists out of the story. But we need to be on guard for that. And we need to understand that the answer to this is not to try and take ownership of all of these symbols ourselves, but rather to be more ecumenical and to fight to make sure these remain neutral symbols that all Americans can rally behind no matter what the cause, which has historically been the case. It hasn't always, there have been these periodic debates, but it has always been the case that at the end of the day, these belong to all of us. And we shouldn't be triumphalist about this. We shouldn't think that, okay, we'll win over middle America by defending their symbols and claiming that they're all conservative now because they like these. No, we need to make space for people of varying ideologies to accept these as proud, patriotic symbols that everyone can get behind. Otherwise, we will risk alienating even more of the country to the radical left. Now you mentioned Maine. Well, quickly, what's going on there is that Maine's original state flag from 100 years ago also has a pine tree on it. It's somewhat similar. It has a beige background. It's not white, but beige. It has a pine tree. It has the North Star. It's not the same as the Appeal to Heaven flag, but as I mentioned, there are a lot of pine trees in that part of the country, so they both have pine trees on them. Main media, probably, I think, just to generate internet traffic when the Appeal to Heaven flag was in the news, started running stories about how Maine voters were going to be confused and start to associate the old Maine flag with the Appeal to Heaven flag. And there's actually a referendum this fall on changing our state flag back to the original pine tree flag. So the current Maine flag, I should mention, it's one of those, they call it a seal on a bedsheet flag. Similar debate happened in Utah very recently. The new frontier of the flag debate is Maine now. So we're having a referendum on that in the fall.
Wow.
Now, I called all my friends. I called some state legislators. I reached out to as many people on the ground as I could in Maine and asked them, are you confused by these flags? And everyone said, what? No one is talking about that. Literally, the paper just made that up in order to drive traffic. And then they had the audacity to run an op-ed saying that anybody who would make that comparison they said, any appeal to heaven, if you'll excuse my language, can go to hell. Anyone linked it to. And it's like, no, you were the only people coming up with that. So I have a story in National Review that was out yesterday about that. So do recommend you check that out for the full rundown of how the main media have tried to capitalize on this and have insulted the intelligence of the voters in the process.
I really appreciate your take on this, James. It's a breath of fresh air because there's a lot of contrived outrage going around. And frankly, I mean, I think the FBI, as I understand it, has listed, well, one of the symbols of potential domestic terrorism is a Gadsden flag. Don't tread on me. And I think that was a key part of the founding as well. But it's like we're being discouraged from flying symbols that show defiance to illegitimate authority. At least that's my perception.
Exactly right. And we need to hold on to these for everybody, not just one faction or another, so that we can all have them in the future.
Hear, hear. Again, we're talking with James Erwin. James, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me at Erwin 1854. That's 1854, year of the founding of the Republican Party. That's my primary platform. And otherwise, just look up my name at National Review and American Thinker to check out these stories about the flags.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today for Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome Sofia Hamilton to the program. Sofia, good to see you. For those meeting you for the first time, take a moment to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you so much for having me back, Brian. My name is Sofia Hamilton. I am a policy analyst at Americans for Prosperity and also a contributor at Young Voices. I focus on issues related to healthcare, drug reform, criminal justice, and housing, and just focusing on researching ways to implement policies to make everyone's life better and have greater opportunities.
We were discussing before we jumped on the air here that not all research is the same. Particularly, you have a wonderful article here from Reason Magazine about researchers who went through the trash in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. And they learned something very important about bans on flavored tobacco products. And I'm as curious about why they were digging through the trash as well as what they learned.
Yeah, I have to laugh. I'm glad that my research job does not involve me digging through the trash. I don't think I'm cut out for that life at all. But yeah, so this study was very interesting. There's been this nationwide trend in the past several years of states and even localities implementing total bans on flavored tobacco products. And we've seen that in states like Massachusetts and New York and California. This new study that was put out in the past month focused on New York City and Washington, D.C., both cities of which totally ban the sale and purchase of flavored tobacco products. So these researchers wanted to see how effective those bans were. And so to tell, they started digging through the trash cans throughout those entire cities, which is just a disgusting job, but they got some good data from it. So they dug through the trash and they picked out all of the discarded vape products, and they were cataloging them and seeing what those products were. And over 99% of all of those discarded vape products in both New York City and Washington, D.C. were flavored tobacco products, which weren't able to be sold or purchased in those cities. So what it showed us was consumers still got the products despite the bans, and they were still using them. So the bans were just not effective at all.
Wow. I mean, look, we had prohibition once upon a time, and I think that was kind of the central lesson of that as well. If people want something, they're going to find a way to get it. But 99% of the ones they found in the trash were the ones that ostensibly are not allowed here.
Exactly. Prohibition policies never work, and we have just historical example after example of this. And not even like just looking at alcohol policy. We can go into prohibition, go back 100 years, didn't work at all. We have two constitutional amendments to show it. But even looking at these more recent tobacco bans. So in about like 2019, the state of Massachusetts totally banned the sale and purchase of menthol products. And that did not stop people from getting the menthol products. Individuals started going into the neighboring states, since all of the Northeast states are very close together. It's not hard to cross state lines. And they started buying menthol products in higher numbers, just so they could then create personal stockpiles for their own consumption to have on hand, because they're driving further distances to get the products, and also to sell on the new black market that was created by the ban. So these tobacco bans aren't working, and the state governments, the local governments are just ignoring the studies and the facts and just implementing ban after ban as if some new outcome is going to happen that hasn't happened in Massachusetts or in California, where these bans have been in play for over a year at some point.
I mean, on the one hand, one can acknowledge, okay, look, this stuff isn't good for you. And so they probably have the best of intentions. But on the other hand, it's not having effect. So why are we creating potential criminals or offenses where there were no criminals before? Maybe there's a better way.
Exactly. I don't want to promote smoking. That's not the goal here, but banning it is, you're just opening the door to criminal justice issues, like seeing in New York City and the horrible murder of Eric Garner, who was selling untaxed cigarettes. There's no reason for that to happen. And then also, in Massachusetts, they were trying to ban the sale of menthol cigarettes because that is the product that is preferred by many African American smokers. And so I can see their mindset there of them wanting to ban that, so then there'll be less health disparities around smoking and race. But then the rate of smoking within the African American community just increased because they're going across state lines and getting more products. And with the flavored tobacco products, these states and these cities are trying to ban those products because of youth smokers. But now youth smokers, young adult smokers are now getting their hands on more dangerous products. So of those products that were discarded in New York City and Washington, D.C. that were found in this study, 99% were exported from China. And those products are illegal to be sold in the United States, and they are unregulated by the FDA. And the consumers don't know that. I don't have a number to pull for you, but I can just say from my own personal experience, I see my friends using these vape products. They have the Cloud bars, the Elf bars, whatever you can get at the local convenience store, the 7-Eleven on the corner. That's what they're using. None of those products are approved by the FDA. They're actually banned to be sold in the United States. They're getting fined by the FDA. But these consumers don't know because they just see them in their 7-Eleven and they think that they're good to go and good to use. But it's just these bans are really having adverse consequences for consumers.
So I have to ask you this, Sofia. I know that we're not, fronting here for tobacco companies, but I have heard from a number of people who were smokers, long-term smokers, that vapes actually were a great intermediate step to getting them off regular cigarettes. I'm curious about your experience.
Yeah, that's vape products were originally brought to the market to have adult smokers who were using traditional cigarettes to wean off of them. And I think there is some worry, and I understand it, with youth smokers and the flavors and them being enticed by that. But these government bans against these products that are meant to get individuals off of smoking cigarettes, which are very dangerous because of the combustion that's involved with lighting the cigarette, it's very adverse to your health. So the vape is a lot better, but it's not a lot better when we don't know what's in these products and they're coming in illegally through the black market from countries like China, where they're not being regulated, especially not being regulated by the FDA. And the government and other government actors are even trying to crack down on other healthier, safer options of nicotine products. Like you can even see the Zyn pouches. There's no combustion involved. There's no smoking. It's not hurting your lungs. There's no tobacco. It's just straight nicotine. There's been orders and different propositions to ban the sale of Zyn pouches, the nicotine pouches, because they're getting more popular. But that's really the safest alternative that we have to vaping and to traditional cigarettes.
Wow. Well, I'm thinking of a quote from the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales. I think it was Captain Redlegs. There ain't no end to doing good. Unfortunately, I know they have good intentions, but the unintended consequences seem to outweigh it. For people who want to dig deeper into this topic, what are some of the resources or places you would point them to get good information that that they can hang their hat on?
I would definitely look at Reason Magazine. This is where I have my article published, but they have wonderful studies that go into the different failed bans, and they focus on Massachusetts and California. And there's just a treasure trove of data that you can dive into, because it's really difficult to look at this and see that these are well-intentioned policies. I think it's a great thing to try to lower the smoking rates, but the unintended consequences far outweigh the good intentions. And just going through things with a coercive mindset is never going to get you the correct results. And we've seen that time and time again. So I think focusing on reason will be a great starting point for you.
Marvelous. And I could not agree more with the idea of every public policy really has to be examined, not just for, well, what is the intended effect of this, but what are the possible unintended, effects or consequences that could arise as a result of this. And, it doesn't seem like many politicians seem willing to weigh those possibilities. It's just, we've got to get this passed. We got to do something, anything.
100%. And sometimes just waiting and doing nothing for a little bit may be better than getting through a bad policy in the end that's going to bring about these unintended consequences. So I think every policymaker should be really thinking through their decisions and understanding what could come about because of the laws that they're promulgating.
Again, we are talking with Sofia Hamilton. She is a Young Voices contributor. Where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, I'm regularly posting on Twitter at Sophie Hamilton. You can follow me there. I'll be posting everything about tobacco, housing, healthcare, anything related. And so follow me there.